Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Spatializing Reproductive Justice, Architecture, Activism, and Advocacy. I'm Jesse Lazar, Executive Director here at AI in New York in the Center for Architecture. This program is presented as part of the Spatializing Reproductive Justice exhibition located in the adjacent galleries and which is on view through the summer, closing on September 3rd. Spatializing Reproductive Justice is a traveling exhibition and programming series that aims to spread awareness of the inequities of reproductive care in the United States and the agency of design fields to expand access. Learning from past and present reproductive and sexual health justice movements, the project addresses the spatial, legal, and social logistics of reproductive healthcare access in the US after the repeal of Roe v. Wade. Our panelists tonight will take part in a conversation on the intersection of creative process and legal rights to abortion access in the US. Representatives from the transdisciplinary art group, How to Perform an Abortion, and Andrew Beck, a lawyer from the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project, will highlight the ways in which artistic expression and legal action can address our access to abortions and women's health care. But first, I'm pleased to welcome Lindsay Harkema and Lori Brown, two members of the curatorial team of the Spatializing Reproductive Justice exhibition, who will introduce our speakers for the evening. Thank you.
Hello. I can hear myself. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. Lori and I are co-curators of the exhibition with Bryony Roberts and Fluff Studio, which is Natalia Dickenoff and Sadie MI. Natalia is also joining us here tonight. And we're thrilled to have this event take place as, I think, the third in-person event that we've held alongside the exhibition, and a really nice kind of rounding out of the events that we've hosted. The first one was a kind of student-focused event. The exhibition is largely built around student work from studios that were taught by Lori, Bryony, and myself at 3 different schools. And then the students who actually produced a lot of the content that you see in the show were invited back here to engage with each other and to share their projects with a public audience. Our second in-person event a couple of weeks ago convened a discussion with representatives from the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation, the SOM Women's Initiative, and some design researchers from Ewing Cole to speak about how professional practice is tackling this issue. There are also a couple of online events that feature some of the professional practices that are whose projects are featured in the show. But I think this one is really exciting because it really speaks to the nature of the studios we taught and some of the content, because we were interested to kind of bring this conversation sort of outside of architecture, while also really emphasizing how relevant it is to the architectural discourse and spatial practice. So tonight we'll be hearing from a transdisciplinary art collaborative as well as a legal expert, and I think sort of discussing and thinking all together about sort of how creative practice and legal advocacy and action are sort of 2 efforts in the ongoing fight for reproductive justice. To sort of ground our conversation, I'll just re-emphasize that reproductive justice was coined by a group of Black women in the 1990s, a group that formed in Chicago, and they were responding to the kind of healthcare reform discussions at the time that largely overlooked women's experiences, but also particularly those of women of color and communities of color, and also just various forms of marginalization. So reproductive justice is the human right to bodily autonomy, the right to have children, to not to have children, and to parent those children in sustainable communities. And that last part, I think, really connects it to the built environment, and so makes it particularly relevant to to architecture, design, creative practice. But then, of course, it expands outside of that and intersects with healthcare and legal action. So I'm thrilled to have this conversation tonight, and I think, Lori, unless there's anything you'd like to add to that overview, we will
One thing,
introduce.
I think
Yeah.
it's important. I mean, one of the motivations we had when we ran these studios, which was immediately following the overturn of Roe in June of 2022, was to really help all of us think about the ways architecture must engage beyond the discipline in order to impact the world and to change it. So to have those voices come into the studios and to come into places like this are really important, because we don't operate in vacuums, and we need to be more responsive and bring these voices and experts together with us in order to change things. So it's fantastic that we've been able to bring Andrew from the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project here and others from in other events, because that's the only way architecture is really going to be changing, is if we bring these voices and force architecture to change. So that was a part of the motivation for the studios as well, and that continues to permeate everything we do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we will introduce our 4 guests and then invite them to come up and share some initial remarks. And then we will ask a few questions and eventually sort of open up for conversation with the audience. From past events, I know that there's usually a really rich conversation between panelists and audience, so we'll try to give enough time for that. Maybe we'll introduce you all, and you can stay in your seats. Andrew will come up and speak first, and then eventually we'll all join. So How to Perform an Abortion is a transdisciplinary creative practice made up of an intergenerational group of women working to expand reproductive rights through art and pedagogy. It's a learning and art project that demystifies the historical, biological, and ethical controversies surrounding fertility management. And their goal is to activate a shift in culture and law in favor of reproductive self-determination. So we have 3 of the collaborators with us tonight. Since the 1970s, artist and educator Maureen Connor has engaged in an exploration of gender and its modes of representation, and is internationally recognized for her feminist work from the 80s and 90s, included in publications and exhibited globally at venues such as the Whitney, MoMA, Cooper Hewitt, Hammer, the Museum of Angewandte Kunst in Vienna, Kunstraum, Munich, and others. In 2000, she pivoted to collective projects with a focus on social interactions that shift the role of the artist from cultural critic to change agent. In 2015, she called attention to the work of Dr. J. Marion Sims, known controversially as the father of gynecology, and contributed to the 2018 removal of the Sims Monument on Fifth Avenue here in New York City. In 2017, while researching a broader history of women's reproductive care, she discovered that certain herbs have been crucial to birth control and abortion for millennia. Teaching at Queens College and part of CUNY since 1990, she co-founded the Social Practice Queens program in 2010 and is now Emerita Professor of Art. Connor and Kadambari Bakshi are currently showing a new project, Growing Histories, Ground Dispersions, at Gallery Marta Cervera in Madrid, Spain, through July 19th. And Kadambari Bagshi, who's a colleague of mine at Barnard College, Barnard and Columbia Colleges, is an architect and artist, and her ongoing projects are focused on concerns for climate, labor, and reproductive justice. Her practice combines architecture, media, and interdisciplinary alliances to produce research-based exhibitions, public installations, workshops, and publications that circulate widely in local and international forums. Recent work was exhibited at the Architecture Museum Berlin, the Seoul Biennial of Architecture and Urbanism, the Art Institute of Chicago, among other venues. As a professor of professional practice in architecture, she teaches design studios and environmental visualization seminars at Barnard College and Columbia University. I'll pass it to Lori.
Okay. And then the third representative of the collective, Landon Newton, is an artist, gardener, and independent researcher whose interdisciplinary practice considers the reciprocal relationships between plants and people. Her ongoing project, The Abortion Herb Garden, investigates the pluralist identities of plants that have historically been used for birth control, abortion, and contraception. Her work has been exhibited at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, the CICA Museum in Korea, the Queens Museum in New York, and Frieze, New York, with How to Perform an Abortion. Some of her publications include You Are Here, the Journal of Creative Geography, the Feminist Journal of the Center of Women's Studies. She is currently a fellow at the Socrates Sculpture Park in Queens, New York, with her work TITL, What If These Plants Get Out, is now on view through April of next year. And then I also have the pleasure to introduce Andrew Beck, who is a senior staff attorney at the ACLU's Reproductive Freedom Project, where he has worked to defend access to abortion care for 14 years. His work focuses on advancing reproductive freedom through litigation, policy advocacy, and counseling healthcare providers. Andrew is a graduate of NYU's School of Law and Harvard College. Prior to joining the ACLU, he clerked for Judge Julio M. Fuentes of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit and Judge Jerome B. Simandis of the U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey. And I also wanted to add that 10 years ago, in the fall, I had invited him to participate in a panel for an exhibition we had held at Parsons, which was looking at then the Dobbs, the Jackson Women's Health Organization clinic, and designing an interface for that. So I was sitting here thinking, I can't believe it's been 10 years since the first time we met and engaged in this way. So I want to thank you for all the work that you're continuing to do. And with that, we'll turn it over to you to begin us, please.
You're welcome to just take a seat.
Can you hear me? Oh my gosh, sorry. I've never been told that I have a soft voice, so I assume you can hear me even without the mic. Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. Just a little bit about myself quickly. I'm not an architect, as you can tell, but I'm married to one. Some of you may know Michael Chen, my husband, and it's strange that, you know, there's an event at the Center for Architecture, and in our household, he's not the one speaking here. Here I am, but we are living in strange times. So I work at the ACLU. I represent clients who are abortion providers, abortion patients, folks helping people seeking abortion care across the country. I've been doing this for 14 years. So under you know, a series of legal standards as the court keeps getting worse and the standards keep getting worse. So when I first started this line of work, we were under the Planned Parenthood versus Casey standard, where we were able to beat back some of the most onerous restrictions passed by politicians, but some, because the standard was so weak, we were unable to stop in court. We had sort of a heyday thereafter under Whole Women's Health, which folks may remember, where it announced a broader standard where we were really able to do a lot of good work. and push back against political restrictions on abortion care, and that was very short-lived, unfortunately, and here we all are. Everyone knows the Supreme Court decided Dobbs, taking away federal constitutional protections for abortion care. I mentioned that I represent providers across the country, and I just, want to highlight at the outset, because I don't think we can have this conversation without talking about the people who are on the front lines providing this care. I mean, also the whole network of folks who are assisting in the care, and patients themselves who are obviously extraordinarily impacted in a devastating way by the court's unprincipled decisions. But the providers who I've represented over the years are some of the most extraordinarily brave, committed, sensitive, remarkable healthcare providers who, work under the most extraordinarily difficult circumstances, right? So before Dobbs took away the right, they still had to, they were confronting political efforts to shut them down, with politicians throwing like every tool in the book, or every tool in the tool shed, whatever, pick your metaphor, throwing everything they could to basically try to get them to stop providing care. They faced threats of violence, they faced protest. Providers I know had to take extraordinary security measures at their homes. They never drove the same route to the clinic, one day after the next, because they needed to take measures to protect themselves. And they did all of this just to be there for the people who needed them, to provide the care that is, life-altering, life-saving. And those are the folks that I've had the privilege of working with and representing for 14 years. And I think important as we talk about this issue to talk about the folks who are actually doing the work on the front line. After Dobbs, many of those providers have been forced to stop providing abortions altogether. Some have moved to blue access states to sort of reestablish clinics in places where they can be provided. Others have been forced to transition into a non-abortion line of work, so providing, other forms of OBGYN care. But, it's been, an extraordinary and devastating thing to see all these folks who are providing life-saving care and doing so with such grace and bravery, and now confronting just, the terrible circumstances we're all facing now. So let's turn to Dobbs. I think I'm here to sort of set the stage and sort of talk a little bit about the legal landscape and what's, coming down the pike. And so for, some of this stuff may be familiar to folks who are deeply steeped in this information, but hopefully it'll some of it will be new or informative. So Dobbs took away the constitutional right to abortion and unleashed what has been a civil rights and public health crisis. So in the wake of Dobbs, 14 states have enacted total bans on abortion. 7 additional states have enacted gestational age bans at 6, 12, 15, 18 weeks of pregnancy, in many cases at points in pregnancy before someone even knows that they're pregnant. And while a gestational age ban may sound more reasonable than a total abortion ban, if you are 6 weeks and 1 day pregnant in Florida and you need abortion care, it doesn't matter to you whether or not Florida has enacted a total ban or a 6-week ban, you can't get that care. And I think it's, another important thing to keep in mind is it's getting worse and worse even in the short amount of time since Dobbs was decided. So an example one can imagine is if you're a pregnant person in Alabama, the day after Dobbs was decided, you could not get an abortion in Alabama. But Florida allowed abortion access. And so while going across state lines is not a simple task for many folks, you could at least go to the neighboring state theoretically to access abortion care. But shortly thereafter, Florida, as a result of an unprincipled opinion by its Supreme Court, allowed gestational age bans to go into effect. And so now abortion is illegal in Florida starting at 6 weeks of pregnancy. So at a point before when most people know they're even pregnant. And so that means that the next closest provider for you, if you are past 6 weeks of pregnancy, if you're an Alabamian, is suddenly North Carolina. North Carolina then enacted a 12-week ban. And so if you're a pregnant person who's 12 weeks and 1 day, Florida is no longer an option. North Carolina is no longer an option. You're looking at traveling to Virginia, Washington, D.C., Illinois. For people of means, these are challenges, but they are likely not insurmountable challenges. But we know that abortion restrictions have the most devastating and profound impact on people of color, low-income folks, undocumented folks, disabled people, people who are least able to cobble together the resources to take time off of work, right? I mean, if you're working a low-income job, low-income folks have less access to unexplained time off on their own terms than folks in, working in a professional setting, for example. If you have childcare obligations, if you have, right, like you can imagine all of the circumstances that make it impossible for a person to be able to drive from Alabama to Illinois to access an abortion, right? You might not have a car that is able to make a, multi-state trip. You might not be able to afford the gas fare. And so these kinds of restrictions obviously are having the most devastating impact on the folks least able to overcome these kinds of hurdles. And so the upshot is millions of people in the country now live hundreds of miles from the next closest abortion provider. Since Dobbs, hundreds of thousands of people have had to leave their home states in order to access abortion care. And that figure only accounts, of course, for the people who are actually able to make the trip. And so others are not able to and are carrying pregnancies to term against their wishes. I think folks think about this often in terms of people traveling to abortion clinics for unwanted pregnancies, but the impact is broader still even than that. So if you have a very much wanted pregnancy in a place like Idaho or Texas, and your health takes a turn for the worse, and you need emergency abortion care, these states have prevented people from being able to get abortions even in dire circumstances, such that people are being forced to be air-vac'd, medevac'd out of a state like Idaho to access abortion care because Idaho's restrictive abortion law prevents you from getting an abortion unless you're at death's door. So if your future fertility is at risk, but your life isn't at risk, you're being literally put on a helicopter and sent to Oregon or Washington to access the care. That was as a result of an order from the Supreme Court specifically allowing that restriction to go into effect. The Supreme Court, as folks may have seen from reporting in the news, at the end of the term lifted that order that it had put in place. I think many people, including myself, think that that was in order to diffuse a political bomb on the eve of an election. And so I don't think we should take much comfort. It's obviously comfort for folks in Idaho at the moment, but I don't think we should take it as a signal of where things are headed there. I could go on and on here. I think I'll just quickly pivot, though, to a few sort of like kernels of optimism or like slightly less doom and gloom because this stuff can get really grim. And so I do want to sort of identify some positive threads. Will at the end, I'm sorry, but pivot back to some doom and gloom as we look ahead. But I do want to sort of elevate some positive considerations, one of which is elections. Every time since Dobbs, the issue of abortion has been presented to voters, and voters have actually had the chance to express themselves on this question. The outcome has been in favor of abortion access and against restrictions on abortion care. You see that reflected in polls as well, where overwhelming majorities favor abortion access and oppose restrictions. And just to name some of the specific examples, places like Michigan and Ohio enacted through the ballot initiative process constitutional protections establishing robust state constitutional protections for abortion, and those have been used now to, we've been in court using those new protections to beat back against restrictions, so expanding access to care. So, I think the role of people's voices and the election process, I think, is the most important for me, sort of point of optimism to cling to. A second positive thread that I would point to is access states or blue states stepping in to fill the void to the extent they're able to. So places like New York have made funding available to help people access care. They've enacted, folks may have heard of shield laws, so laws that are designed to provide protections to the extent the states are able to protect folks providing, seeking, and helping with abortion care within their borders. With full acknowledgement that there's only so much they can do. New York can only protect what goes on in New York. But I think they are stepping in to fill the void in the ways they can. And that's led to some innovative care models. So in, I can't remember the number, 5 or 6 states that have enacted these shield laws, they've enacted what are called telemedicine shield law provisions that basically say, if you're a New York doctor, you can, under New York law, legally provide medication abortion to someone in a state, even if that other state restricts abortion care. So New York doctors are able to have telemed appointments and send medication abortion to people in Texas, even though Texas says that's against Texas law. It has resulted in a sort of courageous practice among folks in New York who are stepping up to provide that care. I say courageous because, right, New York says it's legal, Texas says it's illegal. This is likely to come to head at some point down the line as courts start to work this out. But in the meantime, an organization called We Count, which is sort of tabulating the numbers of abortions taking place in the country post-Dobbs, has documented that 8,000 abortions per month are being provided by telemedicine shield law providers into banned states. It is not nearly enough to make up for the deficit for all of the reasons folks can imagine. But for the people, the 8,000 folks a month who are on the receiving end of that, it is, a lifeline. And then, the third sort of positive trend or development I'll just note is that, while the Supreme Court took away the federal constitutional right to abortion, we've been able to use the courts in ways to push back against some of the most outrageous restrictions. In the wake of Dobbs, Idaho's Attorney General said it was a crime for Idaho physicians to refer patients out of state for legal abortion care. We sued, we got that blocked. It's sort of grim that this is what counts as a victory these days, and yet here we are. Alabama's Attorney General did something similar, saying it was a violation of the Alabama criminal conspiracy law to help someone get out of state to access care. And we sued the Alabama Attorney General. That case is ongoing, but we've gotten some favorable rulings so far, and so things are pointing in a promising direction there. There have been lawsuits, as I said, in Michigan and Ohio to try and take advantage of new constitutional protections. So we are able to make some difference, notwithstanding Dobbs, but it's obviously a harder fight these days. And I'll just sort of close by looking ahead to what's on the horizon. And sorry if it's a pivot back to doom and gloom, but if, there is a more optimistic path, and then there is a deeply, deeply concerning path. It is really weird and depressing to do this work, and sort of a lot of my work these days is planning for a potential Trump administration, and it's a very, very odd exercise to look at the hellscape that we are currently living under and say, these are the good times, because things are going to get so much worse if Trump is elected. And so, we are always saying, and I'll say it here, the most important thing to note here is abortion is on the ballot in 2024. And by that I mean, if Trump is elected, Trump is many things, but he's not completely stupid, and he knows that abortion is politically toxic for Republicans, and so he's gone very mealy-mouthed these days, and he's saying, I'm not calling for a congressional enactment to ban abortion nationwide, but his strategists have made clear, and the people who are making actual plans for his administration have made clear, he doesn't need Congress to do anything. Their plan is to use a law that I had never even heard of a couple years ago that is now suddenly very salient, the Comstock Act. I don't know if folks here have heard of it. But they claim it is basically a backdoor abortion ban already on the books, and that the moment Trump takes office, it can shut down abortion nationwide. Legally, that should be wrong, right? There's precedent saying that the Comstock Act should not apply to otherwise lawful abortion care, but we have seen what value precedent has in this setting recently, and so we should all take that extremely seriously as a threat. Beyond Comstock, they're going to come after medication abortion. This is laid out in Project 2025, which is a 900-page blueprint for the Trump administration, where they will take away the right to medication abortion. A Trump FDA will just withdraw FDA approval for medication abortion. And within that document are dozens of other regulatory plans to in more and more granular detail come after contraception, abortion, reproductive health care in every imaginable way. So it is extremely important that the election not go in Trump's favor if you have any concern for reproductive health care in this country, because the situation now is very, very dire, and it's sort of the existential crisis that we would face at that point is almost unthinkable. So apologies for leaving it on that doom and gloom note, but I will stop there, and then we can explore this further later on.
Yes, come on up. All right. So, as a follow-up, how to perform an abortion. Sorry, it's a little tight. There we go. That one's yours. Yes, available.
Thank you. Thanks, all of you, for coming on this miserable night. Yes, doom and gloom. It is going to be a theme, I'm afraid. In fact, I feel a little bit, guilty, but one of the points that I'm planning to make is, wow, it's going by fast. One of the points I'm planning to make is about every, just about every opportunity that we've had to do a garden or any kind of a project that relates to abortion has been in some way or other rejected, canceled, banned, I shouldn't say banned, but reviewed negatively. We were asked to change the names of several installations that we were doing over the years. So that's not the same as not being able to get an abortion at all. But it does show you how just how much of a taboo discussing abortion really is. And anyway, this is why I wanted to congratulate Lindsay and Lori for this incredible show, which I was so excited to see, 4th of July weekend. And, it's a beautiful show. It's visually beautiful. And you're doing this research that I've been trying to do since 2015. And I think Landon's been working on it longer. So, yeah, you really did it. It's amazing. So, I have so many questions for you, both of you, and for your students as well. But I just wanted to start out, since we're going to have these slides running. Okay, I guess I'm not going to do what I was planning to do. No, it's okay. So the first slides that you may have seen go by in a flash were of trigger planting from 2000. Oh, there we go. Something's going right today. It was from 2022 at Frieze Art Fair, and I'm starting with it because it was included in the show. but also particularly because it seems like a moment when the work of how to perform an abortion became somewhat better known first, and then gave us a hint of the breadth of response, as well as an awareness that the work might have more of an impact at what we were hoping. Since then, maybe not so much, but still. For those unfamiliar with the work, we were invited to create a garden of herbs that had been used for abortion and contraception for millennia by Abortion for Millennia. Freeze invited us as part of their support for artists and nonprofit art spaces through an invitation given to AIR Gallery. We were invited almost the same day in April 2022 that Samuel Alito's leaked memo warning of the overturn of Roe v. Wade appeared. So it's a bit overwhelming to do that project in such a public venue during such a fraught time, but somehow we pulled it together to design a giant wall garden which placed the plants on a map of the US only on the states that had or would have trigger bans. Trigger bans, just for those who are not sure what it is, there are pre-existing laws that are on the books that would immediately ban abortion if Roe v. Wade were overturned, which it was. We had no idea that we would get so much interest. Looking back, it almost felt like we had leaked our own memo in response, showing just how bad it could be. So to explain my own motivation, I'd like to go back to 2015 when I discovered the monument to, and subsequently the work of, Dr. J. Marion Sims, Lindsay already spoke about. I know you're a fan too. But Dr. Sims, who has long been praised as the father of gynecology, in fact operated on enslaved women without anesthesia to cure vaginal fistulas, tears in the vaginal wall causing the contents of the bladder to leak into the vagina, producing infection and odor, usually resulting from obstructed childbirth or sexual violence. Fistulas are common internationally where there is limited access to prenatal care. Their effects frequently result in chronic pain and, in some communities, social ostracism. But Sims wasn't doing the surgeries to relieve pain. In 1808, after US Congress banned the transportation by slave traders of enslaved African people, plantation owners began to focus on increasing the number of births by enslaved women. In the 19th century, Southern white male physicians such as Sims became the experimental partners in the plantation owners, experimental partners of the plantation owners in order to produce more enslaved people. I thought about making a film or more narrative, some kind of narrative work to make the Sims story better known. But I decided there was no way I could see myself transforming that story in a way that wasn't sensationalizing, although there have been playwrights who have found ways to do it, and I do recommend them. I asked myself the question, how could women's health care have come to this, and began to research the history of women's reproductive health care in partnership with Eugenia Manuelian. We quickly discovered that certain herbs had been key to women's reproductive control for many centuries. And together, we founded the Arts and Pedagogy collective, How to Perform an Abortion. Unfortunately, she is no longer engaged, but she's a big supporter. But we began with the founding of How to Perform an Abortion. We began exploring where we might plant a garden, and also where to present workshops about the history of abortion-specific herbs. And I would say also that my own experience with healthcare, simultaneously, I was told I had to have a hysterectomy, and a number of doctors of all sexes told me, the same thing, that you won't miss it. So I looked into that, and it turned out I didn't have to do it, and I was able to wait, and I was fine. So what really struck me, and still does, is just how very bad women's health care has been historically. And, obviously it's not getting a lot better, despite all of the great people that are, trying to make a difference. So, I guess that's the big question. How do we get past the prejudice of the medical profession, of so many doctors? I've spoken to gynecologists to say that I've been doing work about J. Marion Sims, and they say, oh, well, he's great, And you'd think, by now there would be a textbook or something that would let students know. But it's I'm sure we've all had terrible experiences with the medical profession, so I won't say any more. But just one more thing. Our first public garden was planted at SUNY Purchase on the campus, and was part of an exhibition curated by Rachel Owens and her colleagues. At this time, Eugenia and I, who were still working together, contacted Landon, who we discovered had also been working with abortion herbs. She'll tell you more about her own trajectory with abortion herbs in a few minutes. One surprising outcome of that show, which I already sort of mentioned, that happened before the opening, was that we were asked not to use the word abortion in our wall text or the show's title. This was about a year after we had a project for a garden in New Orleans canceled after Kavanaugh was confirmed to the Supreme Court, because the organization we were working with, Women with a Vision, their headquarters had been firebombed in 2012, and they were afraid Kavanaugh's confirmation would inspire other anti-abortionists to do that or something similar again. So we each have only 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop there, and hopefully I can come back and say a few more things.
Hello? Hello? First off, I want to say thank you so much for inviting us and having us here in the Center for Architecture for hosting. But I will speak briefly about my involvement. I come from a background in art and horticulture and landscape architecture, and so and a very, very deep love of plants. And so that was sort of my first entry point into this work. And I created, which is up now. This was an early project of how this project called the Abortion Herb Garden, which was a collection of plants that are exclusively abortifacients, emmenagogues, or contraceptives, so plants that can be used for abortion, birth control. But these herbs, of course, are very well-known culinary herbs, or herbs that are used during childbirth, and so they have this both-and duality property that I think is really interesting when you put that alongside the word abortion, and the lack of nuance in that word and experience and people's reaction to it. And so this work took on different sites. I think because I work as a gardener, it was very plant-focused. And the herb cart that was at the Queen's Museum had these removable garden planters, as well as a bookshelf, library, as well as seed packets. We were able to move it around, and I think that movability and being able to be repeated easily is something that I think is really important about the work. And I think working with plants in general, because they're almost this seemingly passive way of entering a space. You approach something, this project at Denniston Hill that we worked on, You approach something and it looks like a collection of plants and herbs. And an abortion herb garden can be also just a regular kitchen garden, and the only difference could be the name, because all of those plants could be the same. And so that, I think, is just something that, that drives my own work and the interest in this. I think a question that came up for me during this conversation is what roles do plants have now? What roles do plants have next year, in 5 years? And I think after we came together and created trigger planting was at this really heightened time, and we got a lot of press about the work, very Instagrammable, and it was for Freeze, this totally different venue and context for this work to be at. Something else that I did want to mention is that AIR Gallery originally had wanted to put a vending machine with abortion pills in it as a part of their work and contribution to the show, and that was nixed. But these people working with plants and wanting to put plants on a wall, oh, okay, that's good. Yeah, we can have plants. So it's like this. Yeah, but then of course in other cases we weren't allowed. We were unable to use the word, this is an abortion herb garden. These plants are abortifacients. We changed the name to reproductive care, reproductive justice. And so that word abortion can still be a sticky word even in these contexts in which everyone supports abortion, which was the case for the SUNY Purchase School. So yeah, I think I'll leave it that there.
Okay. Thanks. I'll add my thanks to the invitation, but as I'm one of the, except for you, I have worked with all of you, I thought I'll start with something that we actually started last semester because we were all part of a panel, we as in Lindsay, Lori, and I. And I wanted to pick up on that because some of this work and what we want to think about moving forward is maybe something related to that. And that was, the word that came up in that panel was visibility and invisibility. And it was mentioned by Naomi Brain, who has an incredible book. Her book is titled Abortion Beyond the Law, Building a Global Feminist Movement for Self-Managed Abortion. And her book tracks the movements, global movements in Latin America, Africa, South Asia, etc., mostly in the global South, and about how SMA, which is self-managed abortion, and safe abortion access has been a global movement. I wanted to start with that sort of question of visibility, invisibility, because in the global context, not in the US context, the World Health Organization, and this is a quotation we also used in our Madrid show, so this is the world data, not US data that you were mentioning, but according to the data from the World Health Organization, the legality of abortion across the world actually has little to no effect on abortion rates throughout the world. So abortion just goes on. Legal or not, abortions can, will, and do take place. So we have to keep that in mind, even though the law and the legality is really important in the US context. And this is why I want to frame this discussion, at least in terms of my contribution, in this idea of visibility and invisibility. So in the US context, yes, we need visibility. We require strong resistance to restrictive laws, which, as you said, they're coming. So we better kind of get on it. But we have to think about what do we learn from the global context where invisibility is also flourishing as a way to address abortion. So I'm going to just say a little bit about Naomi Brain's book because that was the discussion we started, and I think it would be great to continue here as we kind of move forward. So she describes these movements as networked, horizontal, and dispersed rather than centralized and hierarchical. And she gives many, many examples, but for instance, she talks about the first hotline for abortion was created in Ecuador. And I can just give you a little example. I'm paraphrasing here, so I don't have exactly the words, but so imagine that hotline, the telephone hotline, old days, that was started in Ecuador. They created a video of their kind of hotline. That hotline video was picked up by somebody in Africa, and then they invited them to do workshops. And then that made it to Amsterdam. And then Amsterdam, I mean, you remember that she had a very long discussion. And then the medical providers from Amsterdam then did workshops in Africa about how the pills circulate, et cetera. So just to say that this kind of circulation of information, et cetera, happens through other channels. And this is how most of the world may be able to get abortion. Beyond the laws. So these movements refuse to comply with the laws that limit or ban abortion. They provide care that people need regardless of laws. In effect, this, in Naomi's words, she calls this, in effect, this is civil disobedience without a press release. So I think we just need to keep that in mind as perhaps an alternative. So the structure of this kind of direct action looks very different than many other forms of political work, since visibility is not a goal. In fact, visibility would generally limit the effectiveness of this kind of action. So no signs, no banners, no loud protests, but solidarity-based actions. So a lot of this work is really kind of creating these alternative solidarity-based networks that in their case were these kind of hotlines, phones, and what she described as these accompaniment, basically people who would accompany, and spaces for kind of safe abortions. And I think some of this kind of in global movement, there's some maps there in the show too, so I encourage people to look at that, some of the diagrams and examples about that kind of movement. So I think that's, the criminalization of abortion moved from global north to the global south. This has a lot to do with colonialism and capitalism. We don't have time to get into that, but we have to remember that that's how the criminalization kind of moved across the world. But I think in terms of looking at that book and these kind of self-managed abortion movements and practices around decriminalization, I think that's something we can learn, or we as in, that's something can perhaps move from the global south to the global north. And again, I'm not saying that this, I think in terms of what's coming and your point about November, we actually do need a lot of visible, strong, kind of resistance to it. But I think what we also need to realize that these two kind of visible and invisible, these are coexisting parallels that will remain so. They're not going to go away. So I think I just sort of moving forward, how we collectively think about these issues, I think we should think about. And I'll just mention two quick things. I know I'm probably run with the kind of, I think one is about the point about media ecologies and physical spaces. People, when they didn't have access to kind of more sophisticated media, they were just using telephone lines and kind of community centers as these kind of spaces. So what happens to that now? We have much more sophisticated media channels, and we have the kind of lots of alternative spaces potentially. So just something to think about, that how this kind of, but I think in that case, I also want to make two kind of caveats for that we can think about social media, but we should also think about issues of privacy, because most media channels and social media is privatized in this country. And so if we're going to use that, I think actually journalism school at Columbia is already working on some of these things, like how do you make some of these, media channels more private, etc. But the second point is that we've, the kind of indigenous practices that we perhaps need to relearn potentially, I think that has to go hand in hand with scientific knowledge. I think we have that expertise, we have the science, so in other words, that those two things kind of need to be combined, the scientific knowledge and the kind of and then I think since you're at the center of architecture, this is like my 2 quick points that I did want to make. One is that I think we should think of architects as also information builders. I did a show called Building Information, and from that came out this kind of publication where, we are information builders. We need to build less, we need to unbuild, but we need to, we can work as information builders. The other thing I want to also say is that we want to learn about organizing, and we have somebody in the audience here, Peggy Deemer and Lori Brown. We were all part of the Architecture Lobby's ABC school. And I think, is the book out yet? Oh, well, good timing. So, and I hope I get the timing right. So it's the Organizing Guide to Architectural Education. Did I get it right? So just to say that we all need to teach and learn how to organize. And that's going to be really important moving forward. So shout out to that book for architectural educators. But I think in this context, we should really think about how to organize. And we need all your help to even think about.
Focus on organizing.
Yeah.
You don't have a lawyer for that, but yes.
Well, thank you for all of that. That was incredible. And again, I think there's such a rich sort of conversation that's already been started just in the way that your presentations complement each other. And I'm sure there are kind of voices from the audience also eager to participate. I can start with a first question, or really kind of a continuation of what was just brought up, because something I was also thinking about as you were speaking was about sort of the role of the kind of grassroots, no pun intended, efforts that are strong in the US, but are particularly stronger elsewhere. And I think on this issue, we've seen in places, throughout the global South, in Mexico in the past year, the legalization of abortion was a product of a sort of long history of underground movements, right? So that changed sort of mentality or changed the way people kind of understood access to abortion. So my understanding is that similarly to other places that have been discussed, when no abortion was legal, the distribution of medication abortion or the assistance to access care was happening entirely, through sort of underground networks, which of course we've had that history here too, prior to Roe and increasingly now. But the U.S. is particularly a context where we think more along the lines of we need to protect this right with a law, and we need to follow the laws, and we're in a kind of strange political situation where one side is very much eager to kind of disregard all of the legal frameworks that kind of exist, and another side is a little hesitant to do so, and yet so many kind of unprecedented things are happening, right? So I think it's really important to reflect on how the underground feeds legal sort of results, but we might almost be in a moment in this country where that needs to sort of go in reverse. So I'm curious about what sort of going underground looks like now. And that's an open question for anyone to respond to. We could talk about it in the context of art. We could talk about it in the context of law and organizing. But yeah, what does underground sort of mean?
Well, I was struck by the incredible amount of research you did, and that one underground abortion source was too underground for you. And and part of it is because they really stay underground. They do their best not to, make, although they did publish some of their results. So this is a group of people, collective that is, it's like all over the country, including Canada, and is called under this basically umbrella called holistic abortion. But it's many different groups of people at this point. Some of them are midwives or herbalists, doulas, and they have been kind of in the frame of teaching people how to do herbal abortions, or to how to say, walk somebody through it, or be with somebody, participate, support somebody who's doing an herbal abortion. But they, as I said, they did publish something in a Nature magazine about their research. Was a bunch of case studies where they had actually done herbal abortions. Now, the big thing to remember about herbal abortions is that they have to be early. So, if it's after 6 weeks, it's going to be kind of rough. And they're going to, for the most part, this is just, from information that I've gathered, no personal experience. But I also recently attended an online workshop about tracking your period, which obviously not necessary for me, but I was very curious about it. And, like, how is that possible? Because, again, that's another thing you were talking about with the privacy. And, there are period trackers that you can use on your phone, but a lot of them are really not safe. So anyway, this was a special workshop, very small group of people. And what I understood about period tracking, and for those of you who maybe already do it or know about it, for those who don't, it's temperature, and it's based your body temperature, but also your fluids that have to be tracked. And what's interesting about it, it seems very, very onerous, although just from looking at it from the outside, I'm sure everybody's like rolling their eyes, but at the same time, if you can do it, and that you've had unprotected sex, and you're worried, you don't even have to wait till your period doesn't come. You can try taking some of these herbs, and it'll be safe. It'll be very safe. So, I think that's, in the whole context of herbal abortion, I just want to say that I feel like that's one possible future. And, not that it's legal or anything like that, but.
I think also this speaks to I think one of the kind of objectives of the exhibition. It says on the wall, this is a public service announcement, and something that what you're speaking to is so simple, right? Like, you don't need an app to understand that, but we also live in a time where there's this kind of disassociation with your body kind of through those kinds of tools.
Yes,
and
right.
So, that's just information, right? And again, sort of a normalization of certain kinds of knowledge that we have under prioritized maybe in this country. Yes. And certainly along those lines, thinking about sex ed and the kinds of information that we enable younger generations to access is very low. So that's a good start. Any other thoughts on how to go underground?
I'm not a historian or an expert in this, but there's actually, your discussion was super informative. And there's actually like a US history of that as well, right? So like in New York, before Roe was decided, there was I don't remember the name of it, but basically like a clergy underground railroad. It was I mean, the irony now, right? Like that the church is like, so now that people would rely, there are obviously like religious-based organizations dedicated to helping people or advancing reproductive justice, but it was clergy who operated an underground railroad to help people access what was then illegal abortion. So there is a history not just globally, but pre-Roe in this country of that kind of need, and it also I mean, I think like we shouldn't be under any illusions that like life was great when Roe was the law of the land, right? Like there was one abortion clinic in Alabama, like just a small number, and so people were relying on self-managed abortion for any of a number of reasons, whether it's a distrust of the healthcare system, an inability to access because the only abortion clinic in the state, again, even under Roe, was hundreds of miles away. And so, non-medicalized access to abortion it's a thing that has existed in this country for a long time. And for those for whom SMA is their intended, that there are people out there who like that is their preferred means of accessing abortion. There are folks who work in that space. It's not my field of expertise. I'll say that like it's important, and it's increasingly important for that to exist. It's also not without risk legally, right? Like even again under when Roe was the law of the land, we saw, and we see this more and more now, enterprising conservative prosecutors using existing, not even just abortion laws, right? Because a lot of abortion laws say the pregnant person themselves can't be prosecuted, but they come up with creative workarounds. So like there are statutes that criminalize abuse of a corpse, right? So, or like other sort of like strange laws on the books that they would use to go after people who are trying outside of the medical system to end their own pregnancies. And so, and while SMA there's evidence to support its safety, there's also, right, like if you were designing an ideal healthcare system, you would not be designing one where that is the only option, right? Like it should be an option for people for whom that is, their chosen course, but like, when I need a healthcare service, I go down the street to, Weill Cornell, and that's a right, like that, and even that is not an ideal healthcare system. We don't have an ideal healthcare system in this country, as you were describing, but if you were concocting and trying to create an ideal healthcare system, it would not be reliant on these. But again, we are so far from the ideal that this is, there's a history of it, and it's going to be our future as well, sort of.
But I was just going to say that your last point, that actually, as much as I said about the underground networks, and it's kind of a distribution of power, but it shouldn't have to be underground, right? That's the point. Is not that it needs to stay underground. The point is that these parallel, it should really be just regular healthcare. We should be able to walk into a hospital or clinic, or that should be one way, but as you said, if people prefer something else, then that should also be available. So I just wanted to clarify that I'm not suggesting that, we should just now,
But I think it's also important to think about, so we have these states where women or pregnant people do not have the same civil rights as others in states where it's legal. And so that's the reality of our country now and for the foreseeable future. And so what does it mean to think about the history of reproduction and the history of reproductive care and bringing these things back? So I'm really, like the kinds of things you're doing in these gardens, the issues of what we call it, how it gets disseminated, like this becomes an old arsenal that's being brought back. And I think so many of these other things have to also be operating like that. Is it ideal? No, but nor is it acceptable that people can't access the healthcare they need. So what are the mechanisms that we have to deploy in order for that to happen? And I think it's really important to have more historical knowledge that this was always the purview of women. We were always the ones who had this knowledge and passed it down generation to generation. And it got usurped by the medical profession, and it became illegal, so midwifery became illegal. Now it's not illegal, But there's this rich history that we are completely not, or I would say most people aren't aware of, that we have to come back to and redeploy in the interim until we can do other things. But I think that network and the networks are so critical, and they exist. We may not be connected to them, but in some of the research for a new project I've been working on, they are happening in all parts of the South and other parts of the country, and they don't want to be known. They don't want people to know unless there's like several degrees of separation. So they are there. But I think for me, one of the questions is how can we, or is it even appropriate for us to support them? Because I think it's a racial line, it's an economic line, and I think that's, you know, it was never easy to get an abortion if you were a poor person of color in this country, ever. And so they had to figure out ways to manage themselves. So I think it's also to be aware of what does reproductive justice really mean, and what are the spatial and economic mechanisms that we can engage in to help make that more readily available or pervasive in areas of the country where it's no longer legal. But I think the other issue I think about is back to Naomi's point about, you know, outside of legalities or the extra legal or where we don't care about the law at all, and what does that mean for the ways we can operate and intervene. And I think that is where we are. And so what are these ways that within the system that we can just create a separate system, which is, it has to be separate currently.
I just also want to say that plants are in it for the long game. And I think that there's this interesting, when you were describing states and where a person would need to go, you sort of like see this line and this network of how things are moving, and you think about plants and roots. And I think the fact that abortions have happened for as long as people have been being born and pregnant, and the fact that whether or not abortion is legal, abortions will happen. Plants are this like rock reminding us of this history of the earth and of our bodies, and that interest that people have in connecting with that, I think, relates to that. So it's sort of it's a building block. There's partly reactionary and necessity of what's happening now, and then there's partly a building of, you know, for 100 years in the future, we want that knowledge to be known, whether or not we use a self-managed abortion or a medical abortion.
What are your future plans for your project? I mean, I could just imagine all of these gardens emerging across the country, and
There's
they're
one
not
coming to Barnard in the fall.
It is growing.
It's already growing. Just one. Yeah, it's coming. But I don't know. Future plans.
Well, this is, you know, like somebody else is going to have to take this over for me at some point. But one of the projects that we're showing up here is called Found Abortion Monument, and it was a project that was done in New Paltz on a large set of acreage. There were a number of people other people in the show. It was all about the earth. The show was, you know, about earth-based issues. And when we went up to look at it, Canterbury worked on it, but she wasn't, in the very beginning, she wasn't involved. And Landon and I and Eugenia went up to look at it, and it was Landon who just started pointing out all of the herbs, all of the abortion herbs that were just growing in this wild field. And, you know, it's like, there they are, you know, right there for you. And they're weeds.
That's the weed.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, there it is. So I can imagine doing something like this, like finding places to create these found abortion monuments in different climates, because it's not the same herbs everywhere. So that's kind of a big long-term project. Oh, sorry.
Well, no, one of the strategies we've been using is basically to embed find information where you least expect to find it. So you're not, you don't go to a sculpture garden and see a plant, and then we have the QR codes that would then give you like some data about abortion or even the history, like little, So I think it would be really interesting to see like where can you have these, and I mean, on the one hand, like you should, I think universities, campuses are really interesting. That's something that Lindsay and I did workshop with students, that we started thinking about what should happen on campus. And I feel like that's where the young people are mostly, and and several students talked about that. They really felt that they wanted just access to information that's, and they were talking about like, going to the grocery store and, finding a QR code and so just this idea of, just information and how can that be made more available. So, but also unexpectedly, like you can just, you just come across it where you're least sort of expecting it, maybe.
We also found that, as academics teaching studios, and that is the foundation of this work, there's obviously a freedom for thinking, beyond current constraints that students can do. And, student projects, if you haven't walked through the exhibition, are shown alongside some built clinics and other reproductive healthcare spaces. But I think, the more radical ideas about what could be built live in the student projects. And, it's a bit, I think, clever in a way, because the student work is also maybe like plants, seen as a little bit apolitical, not threatening, right? Maybe not realistic. But
I think it's
yes.
important to note, so Lindsay and Bryony's studios were option studios, and I taught in a required studio. So the students that came into my studio were assigned. So I think there's also the structures of how we teach and what we teach. And at least from my research, there's been studios that focused on birthing, but I had never come across studios that focused on abortion. Maybe they have, but I never found them. So I think there was also a way to, as much as we need to normalize abortion and the word abortion, both in healthcare, also in building codes, the word abortion does not exist in the same way in building codes. It was also surprising to try to normalize it in our education, or the structures of education, and to have students, all types of students, talking about abortion and reproductive health care. I have to say, and it's sad, but it was amazing, because it's like, wow, we have to have these conversations. They are not happening, and now we're helping make them happen. But I had some unease, to be honest, because I was in a situation where the students didn't opt in, and nor could they necessarily opt out. It was unclear a little bit how that may work. But I think that's another kind of dynamic that's kind of undergirding some of this work is, students wholeheartedly, I would say, embrace this in ways that I was very happy and sadly surprised about. I hate to say that, but I think it's important to acknowledge it was a concern going into it for me.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I was telling some people earlier, it was fantastic. Like, everyone in the studio, we were just talking about abortion, and every time I heard the word, it was almost like, wow, because I've never taught this work, although I'd been working on this for now 20 years, but I'd never brought it into the school. So it was, for me, really liberating and kind of surprising,
This picks up a little bit on part of the conversation that we had at the last panel. And, in thinking about holistic reproductive health care and how birthing spaces relate to spaces where abortions are performed, they are often the same space. There are a lot of abortions that take place in hospitals in the same spaces that births take place, because the two go hand in hand. It's all a part of reproductive care. I can share that as the only currently pregnant person up here, I had to have an abortion in order to have this pregnancy, and the two are very linked. So the spatial and the legal separation of these things are artificial, and of course experientially, if we think about all of the reasons why someone might be in one place or the other, they can't always be thought of as connected. But we are, again, like the reality that we live in is one where birthing is very institutionalized, very much embedded within the hospital space. And abortion has been largely, especially in terms of public access, taken out of the hospital space into freestanding clinics. And that at some point was thought to be beneficial for efficiency, for capacity, privacy. Came up at the last discussion too. Many of our hospitals are also affiliated with, religious organizations, and can legally make choices about care according to those belief systems. And so, I think, in a way, we're caught in these kind of binaries that are totally artificial, and again, as sort of architects and as educators and sort of teaching students who are thinking about these, in some cases, those spaces were totally blurred, right? And they were thinking about kind of holistic reproductive health care and expanding it, because we also, had representation of all genders, thinking about other forms of care that are similarly threatened, so gender-affirming care. And in other cases, they were really drawn to something very specific, like how do we deliver abortion pills, right, to unsafe states. And I think that's also the capacity of design and architecture. We're always kind of playing with the rules and kind of thinking about how, we can create sort of spaces or, certain kinds of things to happen that go against those. But I guess before we open it up to questions from the audience, I'm curious if there are sort of any other sort of angles at this that haven't come up yet that you'd like to discuss or put on the table. We've kind of talked a lot about the kind of art practice, gardens, the kind of herbal approaches and the ways that can become a means of disseminating information. We've talked about the importance of legal participation. I think a question that has come up at many of these events is sort of like, what now, right? What do we do? So, would anyone like to add anything to the mix or ask each other a question?
That's a challenge. I know. Well, okay, I can always add more things, looking for something. Well, it's funny because I've been, I do think that if you're talking about the US, we are in a political economy that's driven by capitalism. And capitalism, if there is demand, it's based on kind of supply and demand, kind of. So if there is demand, for example, for pills to be, freely available, I'm just wondering, like, would the kind of market, sort of, make it available, freely available everywhere, right? I mean, that kind of should happen. I mean, it's really, I've been looking a little bit into also the kind of medical histories of pills, et cetera. And it's really interesting with, you know, when the contraception pill, is it RU486, right? That was for contraception. And apparently, when it was this is in the Indian context, when it was introduced in rural India, that's when the people demanded that, well, if it can work for contraception, why cannot it work for abortion? You know, so apparently the story is that demand, you know, drove for kind of medical solution to, you know, for abortion as well. So I'm just sort of thinking, like, is there, you know, is there something that, you know, that can work in terms of the political economy question? And that also, I wrote down those notes, I thought I may as well share it here. So that was when it was created first in France. It came from, maybe you know the history better than I do. And it was interesting because it became a kind of a political issue there as well. And first, it was registered in France, but then the company decided to withdraw it. Because they were nervous about, you know, all the religious kind of backlash. But again, it was interesting. The French Minister of Health at that time, he refused to let the company do it. And now this phrase, which I love this phrase because apparently it became in those days, in the 80s, quite a famous phrase, which is, according to this French Minister of Health, he said, the pill was a moral property of women. So he felt that the company could not offer it because it's. I just love this idea of this is like a moral property.
I mean, one of the things you're talking about makes me think about, so doctors are not, they're deciding to either leave states or not go into states after they finish their residencies because of this. And so thinking about how capitalism works and the demands, you know, are we going to see states where there's an incredible dearth of OBGYNs? Yes. Is it already existing?
So, I mean, like, I mean, there's been a lot of reporting on this already, actually, in a lot of states, but Idaho is the one that comes to mind, where there are not just abortion deserts, but there are OBGYN deserts.
Sure. And that's in Alabama, too.
Right, where people, but like, there are parts of Idaho where you cannot get basic gynecological care now, non-abortion care, because doctors can't practice in the crosshairs of criminal abortion laws, and so the care that they had been trained to provide and that they are, you know, feel ethically bound to provide is in violation of the law. They feel they can't put their liberty on the line and lose their license, so a lot of them have left, and so there's now like huge driving obligations and tremendous wait times in parts of Idaho, not to get abortion care, but to get like other forms of gynecological care because the politicians have scared the medical professionals out of the state. The problem from, like, I mean, I love thinking about this from a like supply and demand standpoint, but you know, it's like there's such a delay, right? Like it's like if you are in need of gynecological care in that moment, then you're like, well, screw my, you know, elected officials. They've really, you know, done one over on me here. But like, it's not, you don't know in the moment. You know, like a lot of these people grow up in conservative environments. They watch Fox News. They subscribe to a whole host of conservative political beliefs. And it's only down the line, you know, like years after these people have been elected and enacted the laws that they want to enact, that you know, feel the repercussions because you can't access abortion care when you need it, or gynecological care because they've scared all of the, you know, physicians out of the state. And so it doesn't quite, there's not a sort of immediate response in a way that leads to the kind of like accountability for politicians that you would hope to see. And but
maybe, would it eventually? I mean, if it gets so dire?
I hope so. I mean, like, I think like in the you saw a like small response by even conservative politicians when like doctors were.
The
well, IVF, right? IVF is the perfect example of it. But even like when people were unable to access like life-saving care, and the politicians were like, well, that's not what we had in mind. And of course, like they're not doctors. They have no idea what they're writing. They're just passing the laws written by, you know, Americans United for Life. They're not thinking about it. And so they have tried in small ways to walk that back. And so like that's in part a political response, but it's disingenuous, and it's just like saving face, and they do it in the most minor way and not in a way that actually protects care in a meaningful way, unfortunately.
Yeah, can we open it up?
Questions from the audience? Several hands.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. How much hard to educate? I'm curious how much you've looked at what other artists have done relative to abortion. I mean, the one project that I'm familiar with is Mothers of Gynecology in Montgomery, which is incredible because it's a tribute to the slaves that have since experimented on. I'm wondering what other things may have influenced you and you've thought about.
That one is on the wall. The reproductive sort of justice wall on the exhibition also has Naomi's book, in case anyone would like to flip through it, and as well as how to perform an abortion. I think another reference that kind of has been mentioned, coming back to kind of the underground networks, the Jane Collective that operated, it's not an art practice, it's again a kind of underground practice that existed in Chicago for a few years prior to Roe, but similarly a network of women working to navigate women in need of care to care providers that operated kind of out in the open and kind of underground. At the time, they kind of benefited from people not really paying attention to what women did. So you could put an ad in a paper and say, you know, don't want to be pregnant, call Jane. In terms of other sort of art practices, are there other references that you'd like to bring forward?
Well, I always think of Women on the Waves as an art practice, actually, and tried to introduce it to students that way, and mostly. So I'm curious to hear more about your experiences with students. You have to be in your class, because I've had similar experiences. But anyway, that's one. But I don't really.
So AIR Gallery.
Oh, right.
So AIR Gallery, which is in Brooklyn now, I think they've had a series of art, right, projects on abortion.
They
A
had,
few.
One show that was
Yeah.
the theme of abortion. But I actually don't know specifically of. I mean, when the Freeze Project came out and Gagosian did a story in his magazine, it was like Barbara Kruger and et cetera, and people who they definitely do work about women's issues and women's rights, but it really doesn't have to do directly with abortion. I really, I think it's very, very repressed. I think that a lot of the people who are doing the work are not getting it shown. We don't know about it. We don't. And people don't want to show it. People don't want to show our work.
Well, and people want to shut it down.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So as the non-artist, but like, I'll just say, like, the example that this reminds me of that comes to mind for me, sorry, no microphone, but you can probably hear me, I have a loud voice. So Idaho passed a law called the No Public Funds for Abortion Act, and so it criminalized any use of public money toward any speech that could be said to promote or counsel in favor of abortion, because like knowledge is power, right? Like it's about like the value of like this stuff coming up in the classroom, right? Like they are scared for people even to hear about this, and so this led to litigation. But before we filed our lawsuit, there was a gallery tied to a university in Idaho, a public university, that had, before this law, been planning to put on a show featuring artists whose work spoke about abortion in various ways. So like, I think there was I don't remember what the medium was, but like a beaded representation of the mifepristone packet or something like that, like various art that had abortion themes. And when this law passed and suddenly the university started to get nervous, like, are we skirting the line? Are we promoting or counseling in favor of abortion by allowing this art to exist on our campus? And they shut it down.
I remember that.
And then we sued over the law, and the law has, the Attorney General has since said that the law doesn't apply in the academic setting, and so we have a relatively recent, decent outcome in the case. But like, I think it's so important for you to be talking about, like, to have a class where this is coming up. Like, students are coming not just from New York and safe places, but they're coming from Idaho,
all over.
right?
I
Like,
had a student from Hungary.
right? Like, and it's important
Yeah.
for people to have access to this just in way, like, it's sort of the flip side of Idaho trying to suppress all speech about this. We don't want people to hear about normalization of abortion. We don't want to hear about anyone talking about promoting or counseling in favor of abortion in the classroom or in art that comes into public university's gallery. This is the flip side of it. It's super important for it to be as normalized as possible and for people of all walks of life to have exposure to abortion in architecture school or in art programs.
I think we can also maybe bring it back to, again, sort of this blurring between art and activism, which sort of in our events that Kadambari and I planned this spring at Barnard, we used action as an all-encompassing term for both art and activism and these kinds of efforts. The original statement that founded the reproductive justice movement, that coalition of Black women that at the time they identified as the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice Coalition. They produced kind of like a zine. It's on the back wall, which, again, sort of speaking of younger generations and academic spaces, college campuses, there's a huge library at Barnard as well. This kind of blurring the lines of what is sort of art, what is sort of popular culture, what is information sharing. I think, something that does give me hope is that there's a lot of savviness in that, and it's coming up from younger generations too. And so even though there are instances where, like you mentioned, where it gets shut down, there's a lot of kind of movement in that way.
I just want to highlight the work of Plan C, because I think they totally blur that line of art and activism for me. For people who don't know, they make mifepristone and misoprostol available very widely, and anyone. I also teach a college class on abortion and contraception. I'm like, by the way, you could get free stickers and put them on the walls of restrooms in hostile states, and it's a QR code, and it's instructions on how to use a VPN, and it's instructions that the pill should be taken orally, not vaginally, so that if you end up in an ER, it can't be detected. And I have a lot of, I'm looking for the optimism, so I have a lot of optimism around medication abortion. The rates have gone, if you look at the rate of usage in the US since which really was bolstered by the pandemic because the telehealth was allowed, but it's starting to approach levels of usage that are comparable to many European countries, and it's very safe and it's very effective, and it's designated by the World Health Organization. Sorry, I'm doing a little soapbox thing for it here, but as an essential medication, and it's one of those areas where, like, yes, they will try to legislate against it. Yes, we will fight it, but it's going to be really hard to stop someone from mailing 5 pills in the mail. I mean, talk about like getting the ACLU up all on business of like, what they're really good. Is the U.S. Post Office really going to open people's mail? Then you're in like a whole other territory. So I'm optimistic about it, but I guess in particular, and Plan C isn't the only organization, but I think that their aesthetic their use of social media is driven by young people for young people. And so that gives me a lot of optimism.
Thank you. There's a few more hands. Okay. This always happens. In the middle. Yeah.
I guess sort of going off that a little bit, but I just was curious about what the actual punishment for the university would have been if they had gone through with that. I guess I'm just sort of wondering, when it comes to things like that, I'm from Alabama, by the way, but there's a huge fear in smaller things, maybe. Not smaller is maybe the wrong word, but maybe where it feels less urgent. And I notice a lot of people don't take that risk, even though, as the ACLU knows, they're usually probably pretty covered. So I'm just wondering how we maybe change the culture where people who maybe don't know how to go underground can be a bit more defiant with less fear of their lives, I guess, being destroyed, because it just, for a lot of people, that doesn't actually happen.
I had a little trouble. I'm sorry.
What would have happened if the university just broke the law and kept the show up? That's what I'm wondering.
I mean, I think it turns on a whole host of things, right? There's the political environment, right? So the prosecutor who sits in an urban space, right? The local prosecutor in Montgomery, Alabama, is probably sort of the bluest of the prosecutory officials in Alabama. And so that person, and so there are questions like, what is the political environment? But there's also things like, we at the ACLU and the lawyers are looking at who has the ability to enforce this law, right? So you see sometimes stories about prosecutors taking a stand and writing in newspapers like, I'm a prosecutor, I'm a progressive, I'm not going to enforce this law. But a lot of states have tried to get around that, including places like Alabama, by basically saying the attorney general can trump whatever so-and-so is doing. So even if you have a brave local prosecutor taking a stand, the attorney general can basically sidestep that and intervene. And they regard it, these are elected officials, and it is attractive to the people they're trying to get to vote for them to go after abortion providers, right? It's not an accident, right? So I think people who are risk averse in those environments and who are not saying screw it, I'm going to keep this art exhibit up, or who are trying to take protective actions and not cross lines, are doing so because they out of a realistic concern. I think the concerns are real, and that's kind of the point of all this, right? The reason the laws are passed and the reason you see attorneys general making these aggressive, ludicrous statements in the public is to scare people and shut them down. And it's an interesting dialogue, right? How much can the sort of the fear shut down stuff that is borderline? And are you in the prosecutor's crosshairs, right? If you're a high-profile person, you are sort of more likely to be at risk than if you're sort of someone who is under the radar a bit, and different people are making different calculations. But I do a lot of work advising people in a number of circumstances around the spectrum of risk, right? Because we're operating, it's a no man's land now, right? We're in a complete gray area where, it's uncharted waters, none of the normal rules apply, and so we can't give legal advice that says this is clearly illegal, this is clearly legal. A lot of it is operating in this gray area, and so a lot of people are having to make really difficult calculations for themselves about how important is it how close do I get to the line, and how important is it for me to do that, and what are the risks to me, and are there things I can do to mitigate those risks? The people around the country right now are having to answer those kinds of questions. So but I think people who do say that's it, I'm out, I can't cross this line, they're not doing so out of a imagined fear. The fear is intentional, real, and people do pay consequences, in certain circumstances for crossing the line. So it's the point of this is to put people in untenable positions, and they have succeeded at doing so.
Do we have time for one more? One short one.
Hi, thank design researcher. I just graduated from a program and focused on abortion travel bans. I'm from Amarillo, Texas, where most of these laws are, there's multiple levels, from contraceptive access to abortion travel bans, et cetera. But one thing I wanted to share, just to think about in terms of like counterinsurgent design, is thinking about rest stops and bathrooms and planting some of these gardens potentially around there. Because where I'm from in particular, if you're looking at human trafficking laws and the ways that there are already like 8 different state agencies monitoring rest stops, talking about labor trafficking, talking about abortion trafficking, which then, you know, there's so many levels to it, but I'm just thinking about how beautiful it would be if there was actually a garden or a abortifacients that also exist in these same places. Because a lot of young folks are just choosing, they're both using zines, they're putting up kits in bathroom rest stops for folks to access things, but there is really real fear, and a lot of the hotlines that did exist, no one is accessing anymore, and people are just choosing to drive themselves without telling anyone what's happening because of cell phone tracking, et cetera. So I'm just really grateful for the knowledge that's shared tonight. And yeah, another focus, I guess, of this that's come up is highway infrastructure, and thinking about highway infrastructure, in particular like nuclear weapons facilities and military.
And we have some projects
Mm-hmm.
out there about that too.
Yeah, so thank you.
Seeding highway medians with the border pass.
Ooh.
Like the new version of Johnson's, yeah. In Texas.
You mean Howard Johnson?
No, like President, what's her name? The wife of President Johnson? She was responsible for the beautification of highways and flyovers. So it's like, update her vision.
What about Howard Johnson?
Well,
I know we have to, unfortunately, bring this to a close, and hopefully maybe the questions that didn't get asked can come up in conversation as we make our way out. But I really want to thank our guest panelists so much for this incredible conversation. And thanks to the Center for Architecture for hosting.
And join us, we're going to have an online event with Jordan Kravitz, who's looking at codes in relationship to abortion, and Deborah Richards, who's designed some Planned Parenthoods in Oklahoma later in July. So please join us for that too.
Woohoo. Thank you.
Thank you.